Hello and welcome back to Poli-Sci 110. This lecture will focus on the unilateral president, or the formal and informal powers of the president, particularly what the president may do without the authority of Congress. Formal powers are abilities or other actions that the president may take officially on paper in order to change the law or change a policy. And informal powers are those that are more personality based or that the president may use in the political arena that don't necessarily involve laws, but that still exert pressure on members of Congress. So what is the purpose of the president? Before we talk about informal and formal powers, let's talk about why the office of the president was designed the way it is. Recall that under the Articles of Confederation, before the American Constitution was ratified, there was not really a strong president at all. The president itself is an innovation of the framers of the Constitution, and the office was designed in order to help solve these collective action problems among the states. So earlier, particularly during the lecture on the Constitution, we learned that different states faced a variety of collective action problems. For example, many of them did not chip in to help win the Revolutionary War. They did not donate the equal or requested number of troops and money needed to fight the war. Some of them began to turn on each other and began to tax goods from other states, for example. The Constitution was designed in part to strengthen the federal government and to help solve those collective action problems. And in particular, the president has the duties to help implement federal law and ensure that these collective action problems are solved, but that the federal law does not favor a particular state, or that one state is not subject to laws while other states are not. Other purposes of the president, of course, include, or other designs, was that the president was not supposed to be too democratic. So people were not given the ability to elect the president directly, but instead cast votes for electors to something called the Electoral College, and they in turn elected the president. This system was designed to elect the best person for the job, and it was not necessarily meant to be based on partisan identification. The Constitution was drafted at a time before political parties had really taken root in the United States. The presidency was also not to be beholden to large states in particular. And so this is another design of the Electoral College. The Electoral College allocates the same number of electors to every state based on how many members of the Senate and House that state has. So even small states that have only 2 members of the Senate still get 3 electoral votes. And as a result, small states can have some influence over the president and presidential elections. But also, the president should both be checked by the other branches, Congress and the courts, and keep those other branches in check as well. This is part of the divided powers framework that we read about within the textbook. And finally, the president would have the primary role in conducting foreign policy and the military. The president acts as the commander-in-chief. How exactly does the president actually fulfill all of these duties? There is a clause within the US Constitution known as the Take Care Clause. And this is a very broad clause which simply says that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This is a pretty big statement. And in order to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, the president can rely on a number of formal powers. So the president often will issue something called presidential directives. These are orders that the president may issue with regards to how a federal agency implements a law, or possibly military orders during a war. One particular set of presidential directives is called the executive order. Many of us have heard this phrase before. They generally instruct federal agencies how to implement a law, or they are used during wartime. As a famous example, the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed enslaved peoples held in bondage throughout the southern states during the Civil War, the American Civil War, is one of the most famous executive orders. That one was issued by Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. Sometimes presidents can make major policy changes and lawsuits will emerge. So for example, if Congress passed a law and the president signed a law, but then a new president takes office several years later, the new president may instruct the federal bureaucracy or various departments to not enforce that law in the same way. Of course, this often will generate lawsuits, and the courts have to intervene and make a decision about whether the president has the authority to not enforce that particular law, or perhaps to enforce it in a different manner. There are also executive agreements. These are different from executive orders in that they involve an agreement between the United States and some other nation or a group of nations. These are not treaties that require ratification by the Senate, but instead they tend to involve smaller, more administrative issues, and in particular, they involve the personalities of the president and the other leader abroad. They often may be temporary. They are not binding law. In the case of a treaty where the Senate has to approve, those treaties become laws, but executive agreements are more like political agreements that are temporary and involve smaller issues. If we look at the number of executive orders over time, what we found is that Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover and other presidents from the 1920s and 1930s really exercised executive orders much more, or issued them much more often than in the modern day. Executive orders have become less common since the 1950s in particular. Although one trend that we are seeing very much so is that presidents tend to issue many executive orders during the first 100 days that they serve in office. So here, for example, we have the number of executive orders issued by Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden for their first 100 days in office. And this graphic is a little outdated. President Biden has already been president for 100 days, but I didn't find information yet to add to this graphic. But often these presidents will issue many executive orders at the beginning of their terms in order to reverse the policies that previous presidents had implemented, or to change how federal law is implemented as well by previous presidents. Presidents often have different priorities, and so they may disagree with each other, and so there will be a change of how laws are implemented. And if it's not certain what exactly I mean by how laws are implemented, that will become more clear during the chapter on bureaucracy. Now, what do the American people think of the formal power of the presidency to change how laws are implemented? If we were to ask people, in your opinion, should the president be able to do the following without asking for congressional approval? We find different opinions. This poll was taken when Barack Obama was in office back in 2014. And we find that typically Democrats at that time were more willing to give the president more power or leeway. These trends often reverse actually whenever a Republican is in office, so that Republicans are more open to giving the president more ability if there's a Republican in office. And so what we see here is that issuing pardons tends to attract agreement by Democrats, establishing new White House offices, freezing assets, declare holidays for federal workers. Some of these are divisive, others are not so much. So for example, calling up reservists tends to attract support from behalf of Republicans and Democrats. And that's the item at the far right side of this chart. But what about informal powers? Does the president really rely on formal powers all of the time? There are actually there are additional powers that are not legal per se that the president can rely on. These powers tend to be based on personalities or how popular the president is personally. So for example, if a president is more popular among voters, then he or she can make demands on members of Congress. So to give you an example, if a president is very popular within a member of Congress's district, then the president can travel to that district and have a rally in order to pressure that member of Congress into supporting the president's agenda. back during the mid-2000s, for example, President George W. Bush favored Social Security reform. And so he went on a 60-day tour across the country, hosting various rallies and roundtable events to drum up support for Social Security reform. It didn't happen back then, but had George W. Bush been more popular than what he was, he might have had more influence in Congress. Importantly, the president can also demand media attention and visit legislators' districts. So these are examples known as going public. Whenever the president is not getting what he or she wants out of Congress, he or she can travel across the country and can try to appeal directly to the American people in order to make the case for his or her agenda. This might get members of Congress to budge, since members of Congress have to seek re-election every 2 years, whereas the president is not up for re-election except for every 4 years. And press conferences are also an example. Recall the distinction between bought media and earned media from earlier during the semester. Press conferences are a great opportunity for the president to receive earned media and to get these ideas out there to the American people. What we've seen is that over the past century, presidents have used these tools more often in order to go public. So if we look at presidential addresses, the number of addresses per year, major addresses that is, have really increased, particularly starting with Ronald Reagan. Or excuse me, the major addresses have remained pretty stable, but the minor addresses have increased over time, particularly starting with Ronald Reagan. However, we've also seen that there's been more presidential travel abroad as well. This also tends to generate media coverage. So presidents have been traveling abroad, slightly more so, but they've also in particular been traveling within the United States, particularly starting with Reagan, often to drum up support for their proposals. And this does not include campaign events. Today, in the modern era, there is some new method of going public as well, and this includes the use of Twitter. What we tended to see was that President Trump would ramp up his use of Twitter ahead of elections, for example. This is unsurprising. This was before Twitter ultimately banned Donald Trump's account. And we've also seen that presidential candidates, in particular Joe Biden, then running for president, also began to engage more people on Twitter or to issue more posts as well. And so with Twitter, we more often have presidents on our phones or access to presidents every single day, assuming that we choose to follow them on Twitter. Thank you.